Some people are born to be reckoned with. Others are born to do the reckoning. The warehouse district of Little Havana reeked of salt air and spilled blood that October night in 1983, where 12 of the Medellin Cartel's most ruthless killers had come to eliminate one woman. Miguel Santos felt the familiar weight of his .45 caliber pistol against his ribs as he led his team through the maze of shipping containers, each man handpicked for their complete absence of mercy. But Miguel carried something his men didn't know about, a rosary hidden in his jacket pocket, a remnant from the seminary he'd abandoned 15 years earlier, when his mother needed medicine the church couldn't provide. They'd been told Griselda Blanco was just another target, another name to cross off their list. What they found instead was a woman sitting alone at a table set for 13, her eyes holding secrets older than the cocaine trade itself. She spoke just 3 words that night: "I've been waiting." And one by one, Miguel's killers began to scream, not from bullets or torture, but from something crawling up from the depths of their own souls. What happened in that warehouse defied everything Miguel thought he knew about life, death, and the price of choosing darkness over light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miguel had heard men scream before, tortured informants, rival dealers begging for mercy, even his own soldiers when operations went sideways. But the sound coming from Rodriguez's throat as he clawed at his own chest wasn't the cry of a man in physical pain. It was the wail of someone drowning in invisible waters, suffocating on air thick with his own sins. "What did you do to him?" Miguel's voice cut through the warehouse's oppressive silence as he kept his weapon trained on the woman at the table. Griselda Blanco hadn't moved since they'd entered, hadn't even flinched when his men spread out in tactical formation around her makeshift dining setup. She tilted her head, studying Miguel with the patience of someone who had orchestrated this exact moment. "I didn't do anything, mijo. I simply reminded him of little Sofia Morales, 8 years old, pigtails, pink dress." Her voice carried the lilt of her Colombian accent, but underneath it was something else, something that made the hair on Miguel's neck stand at attention. She was playing hopscotch when Rodriguez's stray bullet found her. Rodriguez's screaming intensified, his hands now pressed against his temples as if trying to keep his skull from splitting open. Miguel watched in horrified fascination as his lieutenant, a man who'd personally executed over 40 people, collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his scarred face. "Boss," whispered Carrera from Miguel's left flank, "we need to move, whatever game this bitch is playing." But Carrera's words died in his throat as Griselda's gaze shifted to him. "Ah, Luis, you remember Father Martinez, don't you? The priest you shot in his own confessional because he wouldn't reveal what Pablo Escobar had told him in confidence?" The warehouse seemed to pulse with invisible energy, and Miguel felt something cold crawl up his spine. Not fear exactly, but recognition. This was the same sensation he'd experienced during his last year at the seminary, when Father Dominguez had spoken about spiritual warfare and the weight of unconfessed sins. Miguel's fingers found the rosary in his pocket, the familiar smoothness of the beads grounding him as chaos erupted around him. Carrera was on the ground now, his hands clawing at invisible chains around his throat. Behind Miguel, he heard Valdez whimpering something about children, too many children, while Santos, no relation despite the shared surname, had begun speaking rapid-fire prayers he probably hadn't uttered since childhood. "You're not human," Miguel said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. Griselda smiled for the first time since they'd entered, and it was neither cruel nor kind, just infinitely sad. "I'm as human as you are, Miguel, but some of us carry different kinds of weight." She gestured to the empty chairs surrounding her table. "Your employers thought 12 men would be enough. They always underestimate what guilt can accomplish when it finally finds its voice." The warehouse walls seemed to close in as more of his men succumbed to whatever force Griselda had unleashed. Ramirez was speaking to his dead sister, apologizing for things Miguel couldn't hear clearly but understood instinctively. Torres had curled into a fetal position, sobbing about a hospital in Bogotá and a doctor who'd tried to save the wrong person's life. Miguel's rosary grew warm in his pocket, and for a moment he was transported back to his mother's deathbed, her frail hand clasping his as she made him promise to find another way, any way, to survive without selling his soul completely. He'd failed that promise within 6 months, but he'd never stopped carrying her rosary, never stopped hoping redemption might still be possible for someone like him. "Why am I still standing?" he asked. Griselda's eyes softened slightly. "Because you never stopped believing you could find your way back. Even after 15 years of blood money and broken commandments, you still carry pieces of who you were meant to be." She nodded toward his jacket pocket. "Your guilt talks to you every night, but it doesn't consume you. It reminds you." Around them, the warehouse had become a symphony of confession and collapse. 10 of his men were down now, lost in private purgatories of their own making. Only Moreno remained standing, though he swayed like a man fighting invisible winds, his lips moving in what might have been prayers or apologies. "What happens now?" Miguel asked. "Now you choose," Griselda said, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "You can join your men in their reckoning, or you can carry a message back to your employers. Tell them that Griselda Blanco cannot be killed by those who've forgotten the weight of innocent blood. Tell them the ledger always balances one way or another." The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of salsa music drifting from the clubs on Calle Ocho. Miguel's finger tightened on his trigger as he stared at the woman who'd just destroyed 11 killers without lifting a finger. The rosary burned against his chest like a brand. Miguel's finger remained frozen on the trigger for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. The rosary pressed against his chest through his jacket pocket, its familiar weight now feeling like an anchor in a sea of madness. Around him, his men writhed in their private hells, Rodriguez still clawing at his chest, Carrera gasping for air that wouldn't come, the others lost in conversations with ghosts only they could see. "Choose quickly," Griselda said, her voice cutting through the symphony of suffering. "Dawn comes whether we're ready or not." Miguel looked down at his weapon, then at the woman who'd just demonstrated power beyond anything he'd encountered in 15 years of cartel work. The smart play was obvious. Empty his clip, hope bullets could accomplish what guilt apparently couldn't, and pray he lived long enough to report back to the Medellin bosses. But as he met Griselda's unwavering gaze, he felt something shift inside him, like a door, long sealed, finally cracking open. He lowered his gun. "I'll deliver your message," he said. Griselda nodded, as if she'd expected nothing else. "They won't believe you at first. They'll think you failed because you're weak, because you've gone soft." She gestured toward his fallen men. "But eventually, they'll understand that some battles can't be won with bullets." Miguel holstered his weapon and stepped over Valdez, who was now speaking to what sounded like his grandmother, begging forgiveness for sins Miguel couldn't begin to imagine. "What about them? They'll find their way out when they're ready, or they won't." Griselda's expression remained neutral. That was always their choice to make. The drive back to his apartment in Coral Gables took place in a haze of disbelief and exhaustion. Miguel's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, the events in the warehouse playing on an endless loop in his mind. Twice he had to pull over to vomit, his body rejecting not just the adrenaline but something deeper, the taste of his own complicity in whatever had just occurred. His apartment building stood like a monument to legitimate success, its Art Deco facade and doorman carefully designed to suggest he was anything other than what he actually was. The cartel paid well for his services, and Miguel had always been careful to maintain the appearance of a successful import-export businessman. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, polite man who kept odd hours and received very few visitors. "Good evening, Mr. Santos," the night doorman said as Miguel entered the lobby. "Working late again?" "Something like that, Eduardo." Miguel's voice sounded normal to his own ears, which somehow made everything worse. How could he sound so ordinary after what he'd witnessed? The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt like ascending through layers of a life that no longer made sense. His apartment was exactly as he'd left it 6 hours earlier, immaculate, expensive, and utterly empty of anything that mattered. The leather furniture had been selected by an interior designer, the art chosen for its investment value rather than beauty. Even the books on his shelves were props, carefully curated to support his cover identity. Miguel poured 3 fingers of Colombian rum and stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Miami skyline. Somewhere out there, 11 of his best men were either dead, insane, or something in between. And somewhere else, Griselda Blanco was probably preparing for the next group of killers that would inevitably be sent her way. The rosary felt heavier as he pulled it from his pocket. His mother's rosary, worn smooth by decades of desperate prayers. She'd given it to him the night before she died, her cancer-ravaged hand barely strong enough to press the beads into his palm. "Promise me, Miguel," she'd whispered, her voice already fading. "Promise me you'll find another way." He'd been 28 then, fresh out of seminary but already disillusioned with the church's inability to address the poverty and violence consuming their neighborhood in Medellin. The cartel had offered him a choice: work for them or watch his younger sister disappear into the same pipeline that had claimed so many other girls from their barrio. It hadn't felt like a choice at all. But sitting in his expensive apartment, surrounded by the spoils of 15 years' worth of moral compromises, Miguel began to wonder if he'd been lying to himself about having no alternatives. The guilt that had protected him in that warehouse, the guilt Griselda had recognized and somehow respected, was the same guilt that had been eating at him for years, whispering that every job could be his last, every kill could be the one that finally severed whatever thin threads still connected him to the man he'd once hoped to become. His phone would ring soon. The Medellin bosses would want to know why their million-dollar hit team had failed to eliminate one middle-aged woman. They'd demand explanations he couldn't possibly give without sounding insane. Miguel fingered the rosary beads and tried to imagine how to explain that they'd sent 12 men to kill Griselda Blanco, but only one had walked out, and he'd done so only because he'd never quite forgotten how to pray. The phone rang at exactly 3:17 a.m. Miguel had been sitting in his leather chair for hours, the rosary draped across his knuckles like a weapon he'd forgotten how to use. The Colombian rum sat untouched on the glass table beside him, its amber surface reflecting the city lights that never quite died in Miami. He'd known this moment was coming, had felt its approach like a storm gathering on the horizon. But hearing the actual ring still sent ice through his veins. On the 4th ring, he answered. "Miguel." The voice belonged to Don Esteban Morales, one of the Medellin Cartel's most senior commanders, and the man who'd personally selected Miguel's team for the Griselda contract. His tone carried the weight of authority built on decades of blood and betrayal. "Don Esteban, tell me she's dead." Miguel closed his eyes, feeling the rosary beads cut into his palm as his grip tightened. "She's not dead." The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. When Morales spoke again, his voice had dropped to the register that usually preceded someone's disappearance. "Explain." Miguel had rehearsed this conversation during the long hours of waiting, but facing the actual moment, every prepared lie crumbled into dust. The operation failed. Rodriguez is dead. Carrera too. All of them, except you. Yes. Another silence, this one more dangerous than the first. Miguel could almost hear Morales' mind working, calculating probabilities, assessing threats. In the cartel's paranoid ecosystem, survival when others died was often viewed as the deepest form of betrayal. "You're telling me that Griselda Blanco, a 47-year-old woman with no significant security detail, killed 11 of our best operators while somehow sparing you?" Miguel's throat felt like sandpaper. It wasn't like that. "Then tell me what it was like." The truth sat in Miguel's chest like a confession that could save or damn his soul. He thought of Rodriguez clawing at invisible wounds, of Carrera choking on air thick with his own sins, of 10 other hardened killers reduced to weeping children by forces that belonged in scripture rather than reality. How could he explain that Griselda Blanco possessed the ability to weaponize guilt itself? Who would believe that the warehouse had become a kind of spiritual battlefield where traditional weapons meant nothing? "She knew we were coming," Miguel said finally. "She was prepared for us in ways we couldn't anticipate." "That's not an explanation, that's an excuse." Morales' voice had turned arctic. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Miguel. What happened in that warehouse?" Miguel stood and walked to his window, looking down at the empty streets of Coral Gables. A police cruiser moved slowly through the intersection below, its occupants unaware that 14 floors above them, A conversation was taking place that would determine whether Miami's cocaine trade continued as usual or descended into the kind of supernatural warfare that made conventional business impossible. "She turned them against themselves," Miguel said, the words coming out in a rush. "I don't know how, but she made them see things, remember things, that destroyed them from the inside. It wasn't bullets or blades, it was something else entirely." The silence this time lasted almost a full minute. When Morales spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Not anger, but something far more unsettling. Curiosity mixed with recognition. "Did she give you a message?" The question hit Miguel like a physical blow. Did she give you a message, Miguel?" Miguel's hand found the rosary in his pocket, the beads now warm against his palm. "She said to tell you that Griselda Blanco cannot be killed by those who've forgotten the weight of innocent blood. She said the ledger always balances." Another pause, but this one felt different. When Morales spoke, his voice carried undertones Miguel had never heard before, something that might have been fear or respect or both. "There will be no second attempt," Morales said. "Sir, you heard me. The Griselda contract is terminated, effective immediately." Miguel felt the world shift beneath his feet. The cartel never abandoned a contract, especially one worth as much as the Griselda hit. "Don Esteban, I don't understand." "You're not supposed to understand, but you are supposed to disappear for a while. Take a vacation, Miguel. Visit family. Stay away from Miami until I tell you it's safe to return." The line went dead before Miguel could respond. He stood holding the silent phone, his reflection ghost-like in the window glass. Outside, dawn was beginning to creep across the eastern sky, painting the city in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere out there, Griselda Blanco was probably having her morning coffee, victorious in ways that defied every rule Miguel thought governed their world. The rosary seemed to pulse in his pocket, and for the first time in 15 years, Miguel found himself wondering if his mother's promise might still be possible to keep. Miguel set the phone down with trembling fingers, but the tremor had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming weight of possibility. The cartel never backed down. In 15 years of service, he'd never heard Don Esteban abandon a contract, much less one that carried the prestige of eliminating Griselda Blanco. Yet something in his commander's voice, that subtle undertone that might have been fear or respect, suggested Morales knew more about what had happened in that warehouse than he was willing to admit. The rosary burned against Miguel's palm as he pulled it from his pocket, its worn silver crucifix catching the first rays of dawn filtering through his apartment windows. His mother's face materialized in his memory with startling clarity, her sunken cheeks, her eyes bright with fever and desperate hope, her voice barely a whisper as she'd pressed these same beads into his hands. "Promise me you'll find another way, mijo. Promise me you won't let them take your soul completely." He'd failed that promise within 6 months of her death, driven by necessity and the cartel's persuasive recruitment methods. But sitting in his sterile apartment, surrounded by the material rewards of moral compromise, Miguel began to understand that his mother's prayers might have been more powerful than he'd ever imagined. How else could he explain surviving what had destroyed 11 hardened killers? How else could he account for the protection he'd felt when Griselda's otherworldly power had washed over his men like a tide of judgment? The intercom buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. Miguel's blood turned to ice. It was barely 5 in the morning, too early for legitimate visitors, too late for anyone with innocent intentions. The cartel's reach extended everywhere in Miami, and if Don Esteban had decided Miguel knew too much about what had really happened. "Mr. Santos?" Eduardo's voice crackled through the speaker, tinged with nervousness. "There's a woman here to see you. Says it's urgent." Miguel's hand instinctively moved toward the Glock he kept in his desk drawer, then froze. A woman. At dawn. After the night he'd just experienced, coincidences felt as rare as honest politicians in Miami. "What's her name?" "She says you'll know why she's here. Says to tell you the ledger isn't finished balancing." The rosary slipped from Miguel's fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. Griselda. Somehow, impossibly, she was here, in his building, asking for him by name as if they were old friends rather than predator and survivor of a supernatural battlefield. Miguel's mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Had she come to finish what the warehouse had started, to complete whatever reckoning his guilt had temporarily shielded him from? Or was this something else entirely? A test, a proposition, an offer of the redemption his mother had died believing was still possible. "Send her up," he heard himself say. "Sir, are you certain? Building policy states that. Send her up, Eduardo." Miguel straightened his shirt and tried to impose order on the chaos of his thoughts. The apartment suddenly felt like a monument to his own moral bankruptcy. Expensive furniture purchased with blood money, artwork chosen for investment value rather than beauty, books he'd never read supporting a cover identity built on lies. What would Griselda see when she looked around this place? What would her otherworldly perception reveal about the man who'd spent 15 years trying to convince himself he was just another businessman in a city built on profitable secrets? The elevator chimed with mechanical cheerfulness, followed by the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. Miguel found himself holding his breath, his hand unconsciously moving to where the rosary had fallen. The woman who'd destroyed his entire team without lifting a finger was walking toward his door, and he had no idea whether she came as an angel of mercy or an instrument of final judgment. 3 soft knocks echoed through the apartment. Miguel's throat felt like sand as he approached the door, each step carrying him further from the life he'd known and deeper into territory that belonged in his mother's prayers rather than his professional reality. Through the peephole, he could see Griselda standing calmly in the hallway, wearing a simple black dress that made her look like any middle-aged woman visiting a friend. Nothing in her appearance suggested she possessed the power to weaponize guilt itself, yet Miguel's hands shook as he reached for the deadbolt. The rosary caught the morning light from behind him, its silver surface gleaming like a promise he'd never quite managed to break. Miguel turned the lock and opened the door to whatever came next. "Buenos dias, Miguel." Griselda's voice carried the same unsettling calm he remembered from the warehouse, as if greeting the sole survivor of a supernatural massacre was as routine as ordering coffee. "May I come in?" Miguel stepped aside wordlessly, his body moving before his mind could process the enormity of inviting the cocaine godmother into his sanctuary. She entered with the unhurried grace of someone who owned every space she occupied, her dark eyes taking in the expensive emptiness of his apartment with what might have been amusement or pity. "Lovely view," she said, moving toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where dawn painted Miami in deceptive pastels. "You can see almost everything from up here. The port where the ships bring their cargo, the neighborhoods where people pretend not to know what that cargo contains, the churches where they pray for forgiveness while counting money that smells like blood." Miguel closed the door, the click of the deadbolt sounding like a coffin lid sealing shut. "Why are you here?" Griselda turned from the window, and for a moment her silhouette merged with the rising sun behind her, creating an optical illusion that made her appear larger than her physical form, as if she cast shadows in dimensions Miguel couldn't perceive. "Your commander knows what I am," she said simply. "Esteban Morales may dress like a businessman now, but he grew up in the mountains where his grandmother read cards and spoke to the dead. He understands there are forces in this world that bullets cannot touch." She gestured toward his leather furniture, his expensive art, the carefully curated books. "The question is whether you understand." Miguel's hand found the rosary on the floor, his fingers closing around the familiar weight of his mother's faith. "I understand that 11 men are dead or broken because of what happened in that warehouse. I understand that you possess abilities that shouldn't exist." He straightened, meeting her gaze. "But I don't understand why you're here instead of letting me disappear like Morales suggested. Because disappearing isn't the same as choosing, Miguel." Griselda moved closer, her presence filling the room like incense smoke. "You survived last night because something in you recognized the weight of innocent blood. But recognition isn't transformation. Understanding isn't redemption." She paused before his bookshelf, running her finger along spines he'd never opened. "Your mother's prayers created a shield around your soul, but shields can only protect for so long. Eventually, you have to decide who you really are." The mention of his mother hit Miguel like a physical blow. "How do you know about—" "I know because the dead don't truly leave, Miguel. They linger around the choices of those they loved, hoping their influence might tip the scales toward light. Griselda pulled a slim volume from his shelf, a leather-bound copy of scripture he'd bought for appearance but never touched. Maria Santos died believing her son might still find another way. The question is whether she died believing the truth or clinging to a beautiful lie. Miguel felt something crack open inside his chest, a fault line 15 years in the making. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to choose." Griselda set the book on his glass table, its worn leather cover stark against the expensive surface. "The cartel will leave me alone for now, but they'll never stop completely. There will always be another contract, another attempt, another group of killers who've forgotten the weight of innocent blood. What happened in that warehouse last night was just the beginning." She moved to his window again, looking out at the city that had made them both wealthy through violence and moral compromise. "I'm offering you something your 15 years of service never could, Miguel. I'm offering you the chance to balance your own ledger." "By doing what?" "By helping me remind this city what justice actually looks like." Griselda's reflection in the window seemed to shimmer, as if she existed partially in this world and partially in another. The cartels have turned Miami into a place where money matters more than lives, where power protects the guilty while the innocent suffer. But power built on blood always collapses eventually. The only question is whether it falls naturally or whether someone helps it along. Miguel's apartment suddenly felt like a prison cell, its luxury transformed into evidence of his complicity. Every expensive surface, every carefully chosen decoration, every book he'd never read seemed to mock the man he'd once hoped to become. Through the windows, Miami stretched toward the horizon like a beautiful lie, its Art Deco elegance hiding the rot that money and violence had bred in its heart. "If I say yes," he said quietly, "there's no going back." "There was no going back the moment you opened that door." Griselda turned from the window, her eyes reflecting light in ways that defied physics. "The only choice left is whether you move forward carrying your mother's faith or your cartel's gold." Miguel looked down at the rosary in his palm, its silver worn smooth by decades of desperate prayer. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were beginning to ring, calling the faithful to morning mass in a dozen languages. He thought of his mother's face, of promises broken and roads not taken, of 11 men who would never again have the chance to choose differently. "What do you need me to do?" Griselda's smile contained depths that reminded Miguel of stained glass windows, beautiful from a distance, but revealing intricate complexity upon closer examination. "First, you need to understand what you're truly offering to help with." She moved to his dining table and sat with the casual authority of someone conducting business in her own home. "The cartel world operates on principles you think you understand: territory, profit, fear. But there's another layer beneath all that. A spiritual economy where every innocent death creates a debt that must eventually be paid." Miguel remained standing, the rosary warm in his palm. "You're talking about justice." "I'm talking about balance." Griselda gestured for him to sit across from her. "Your mother understood this. When she prayed for your soul every night, she wasn't just asking for your salvation. She was building spiritual protection around you, credit against the debts you were accumulating. It's why you survived last night when the others couldn't." The leather chair felt foreign beneath Miguel as he sat, as if he were occupying someone else's life. "And the others? Rodriguez Carrera, what happened to them?" "They faced the weight of their choices without protection." Griselda's eyes seemed to look through him into territories that existed beyond physical sight. Each man who's taken innocent life carries those deaths with him, whether he acknowledges it or not. What I do is simply make that weight visible, immediate. Some collapse under it immediately. Others, she paused, her head tilting slightly. Others find ways to bear it. A chill ran down Miguel's spine as implications crystallized. "You're saying they're still alive?" "I'm saying death isn't the only form of judgment, Miguel. Sometimes redemption requires living with full knowledge of what you've done." Griselda stood and walked to his kitchen, opening cabinets with the familiarity of an old friend. "Coffee?" The mundane question felt surreal after everything they'd discussed, but Miguel nodded numbly. He watched her move through his space with casual efficiency, noting how she seemed to know exactly where everything was located despite never having been here before. Another manifestation of her otherworldly perception, or something else entirely? The cartel system works because most people can compartmentalize, Griselda continued, measuring coffee with practiced precision. They tell themselves the violence is business, that the dead were criminals anyway, that innocent people only get hurt when they choose to get involved. These lies make the work bearable. The coffee machine hummed to life, its mechanical rhythm oddly comforting. But lies have weight too, Miguel. They accumulate like interest on unpaid debts. Miguel found himself thinking of his own rationalizations, the mental gymnastics he'd performed for 15 years to justify the money, the lifestyle, the choices that had led him further and further from his mother's hopes. What makes you different? You've built your own empire on violence. Because I never forgot the weight. Griselda returned with 2 steaming cups, setting one before him. Every person who died for my operation, every family destroyed by my product, every child who lost a parent to my wars. I carry all of it. The difference is that I chose to carry it consciously rather than pretending it doesn't exist. The coffee was perfect. Strong, bitter, exactly as he preferred it. Another small impossibility in a morning full of them. And that gives you the right to judge others? It gives me the ability to show them what they've been hiding from themselves. Griselda sipped her coffee, her gaze growing distant. Do you know why your commander really called off the contract, Miguel? Miguel felt the conversation shifting into deeper waters. Because he knows you can't be killed by conventional means. Because he remembers what happened to the Ochoa brothers. Griselda's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. 1983. They sent a team after me in Medellin. 12 men, just like yours. Professional killers with no conscience and no fear. She set down her cup, the ceramic clicking against glass with finality. When the police found them 3 days later, they were sitting in a circle in an abandoned church, weeping and confessing their sins to empty air. They'd written the names of their victims on the walls in their own blood, hundreds of names going back years. Miguel's blood turned cold. What happened to them? They're still there, still confessing. The locals leave them food and water, but none of them have spoken a coherent word since. The church has become a pilgrimage site. Families of victims come to hear their loved ones' names spoken in eternal penance. The rosaries seem to burn against Miguel's skin. And Morales knows this? Esteban was the one who sent them. Griselda's eyes met his across the table. He's spent the last 5 years trying to forget what he saw when he went to investigate. Some knowledge changes you forever, Miguel. The question is whether you let it destroy you or transform you. Outside, Miami was waking up, traffic beginning to flow, people starting their days, the city's heartbeat resuming its familiar rhythm. But inside the apartment, Miguel felt suspended between 2 worlds, balanced on a knife's edge between the man he'd been and someone he might still become. What do you need me to do? He asked again. Griselda smiled, and this time it carried warmth instead of mystery. Help me teach this city to remember what it's forgotten. Miguel stared at Griselda across his dining table, the morning light casting her face in alternating patterns of shadow and gold. Her words hung between them like smoke from his mother's old prayer candles. Help me teach this city to remember what it's forgotten. Teach them what? Exactly? Miguel's voice came out rougher than he intended. The coffee had grown cold in his hands, forgotten as the weight of her proposition settled over him. That actions have consequences. That blood demands blood. That the innocent dead don't simply disappear because it's convenient for the living to forget them. Griselda rose from her chair and moved to his window again, her silhouette outlined against the Miami skyline. This city has built its prosperity on willful blindness, Miguel. People know where the money comes from, but they choose not to see. They know children die for their cocaine, but they choose not to care. They know families are destroyed, communities poisoned, souls corrupted, but they choose comfort over conscience. Miguel joined her at the window, looking out at the glittering towers and pristine beaches that had become his prison. And you think that can be changed? I think it must be changed. Her reflection in the glass seemed to shimmer with otherworldly authority. The spiritual debt this city has accumulated is staggering. Every dollar earned from suffering, every life destroyed for profit, every family torn apart by greed. All of it creates an imbalance that eventually demands correction. The rosary pressed against Miguel's palm like a brand. What kind of correction? The kind that starts with individuals choosing differently. Griselda turned to face him directly, her eyes holding depths that made him feel exposed, examined, weighed on scales he couldn't see. Your commander isn't the only one who remembers the Ochoa brothers, Miguel. Word has spread through certain circles. There are others in this business who've begun to question whether the price they're paying is worth the profit they're earning. Miguel felt his world tilting off its axis. You're talking about building some kind of network. I'm talking about offering redemption to those ready to accept its cost. Her smile carried the weight of ancient promises. Not everyone who enters this life chooses it freely. Not everyone who stays does so willingly. Fear, necessity, survival. These things can trap good people in terrible circumstances. But trapped doesn't mean lost, Miguel. It just means they need someone to show them another way. The implications cascaded through Miguel's mind like dominoes falling. A network of cartel insiders turning against the system from within. Intelligence shared, operations disrupted, the kind of coordinated resistance that could bring down entire organizations. It was audacious to the point of insanity. Morales would have me killed the moment he suspected. Esteban Morales is paralyzed by what he saw in that church, Griselda said quietly. He spent 5 years trying to pretend he doesn't believe in forces beyond bullets and bank accounts, but belief isn't optional when you've seen proof. He won't move against me again, which means he won't move against you, as long as you're careful. Miguel's phone buzzed against the glass table, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the morning stillness. The display showed Morales' number, and Miguel felt his mouth go dry. Coincidences had become impossible to believe. Answer it, Griselda said. But remember, you're still the man who survived what destroyed 11 others. Act accordingly. Miguel's hand trembled slightly as he accepted the call. Morales, Santos. His commander's voice sounded strained, older somehow than it had yesterday. We need to talk, my office, 1 hour. About what? A long pause filled with the sound of expensive scotch being poured. About what happened last night. About what you saw. About what we do now that everything we thought we understood about this business has turned to ash. The line went dead. Miguel set the phone down, his reflection in the black screen showing a man he barely recognized, hollow-eyed, uncertain, balanced on the edge of choices that would define whatever remained of his life. He knows, Miguel said. He suspects. Griselda moved closer, her presence filling his apartment like incense. But suspicion isn't proof, and proof isn't action. Esteban is a practical man who's discovered that practicality has limits. He's looking for a way to navigate territory his MBA never prepared him for. Miguel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 15 years pressing down on his shoulders like stones. His mother's rosary seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, a rhythm that matched the prayer she'd whispered every night for a son she'd never stopped believing could find his way home. If I do this, he said finally, if I help you, there's no guarantee I survive it. There's no guarantee you survive refusing it either. Griselda's hand touched his shoulder with surprising gentleness. But survival isn't the highest goal anymore, Miguel. Redemption is. And redemption requires risk. Outside, Miami gleamed in the morning sun like a jewel built on bones, beautiful and terrible, and waiting for someone to finally tell it the truth. Miguel drove through Miami's morning traffic in a daze, Griselda's words echoing in his mind like his mother's old prayers, insistent, inescapable, demanding a response he wasn't sure he could give. The city looked different now, as if her presence had stripped away a filter he hadn't realized was there. Every gleaming tower seemed to pulse with blood money. Every pristine street corner whispered of the violence that had paid for its cleanliness. The cartel's headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a glass monument to legitimate business. Import-export operations, shipping logistics, investment portfolios that looked clean on paper but carried the stench of Colombian coca fields in their margins. Miguel had walked these halls for 15 years, but today they felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of choices that could never be undone. Morales' secretary nodded him through without her usual smile. Even she seemed to sense the shift in the air, the way reality had become unstable since last night. Miguel found his commander standing at the window that dominated his corner office, silhouetted against the Miami skyline, like a man contemplating his own execution. "Close the door," Morales said without turning around. Miguel's hand hesitated on the handle. Once that door closed, everything would change. The conversation they were about to have would transform him from soldier to conspirator, from asset to threat, from the man who'd survived the impossible to the man who knew too much about why. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot. 15 years, Morales said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 15 years I've built this operation on the principle that everything can be quantified, managed, controlled. Supply chains, profit margins, acceptable losses, all of it reducible to numbers on a spreadsheet. He turned, and Miguel saw his commander's face properly for the first time. Morales looked like he'd aged a decade overnight, his eyes haunted by visions that numbers couldn't explain away. "What happened in that warehouse defies every principle I've based my life on," Morales continued. 11 men, professional killers, men I'd trust with my own life, reduced to gibbering shells by a woman sitting at a table. No weapons, no guards, no logical explanation for how she could have possibly... He trailed off, pouring scotch with shaking hands despite the early hour. Miguel remained silent, knowing that his commander's crisis of faith was just beginning. "But here's what really terrifies me, Santos." Morales drained his glass in one burning swallow. It wasn't the first time. The words hit Miguel like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "The Ochoa contract, 1983, Medellin." Morales' voice dropped to a whisper. "I was younger then, ambitious, certain that sufficient violence could solve any problem. 12 men, the best killers money could buy. When they didn't report back, I flew down personally to investigate." Miguel felt the room spinning around him, reality reshaping itself into patterns that made terrible sense. "You saw them." "I found them in a church that had been abandoned for 20 years, sitting in a circle, weeping, writing names on the walls in their own blood, names of people they'd killed going back to their first murders as children on the streets." Morales' hands trembled as he refilled his glass. "They looked at me when I entered, Miguel. Looked right through me to something behind my shoulder, something I couldn't see but could feel breathing down my neck." The rosary burned against Miguel's chest like a brand. His mother's prayers, the protection Griselda had spoken of. How long had he been walking through darkness without realizing what kept him safe? Miguel forced himself to remain steady, to project the image of a loyal soldier grappling with incomprehensible events. But inside, something was crystallizing, a terrible clarity about what Griselda represented, what she offered, and what the cost of that offer would be. "What are you telling me?" Miguel asked. "I'm telling you that Griselda Blanco isn't just another cartel queen." Morales met his eyes with desperate intensity. "She's something else entirely. Something that makes our entire world look like children playing with toys we don't understand." The weight of decision pressed down on Miguel's shoulders like his mother's hands, guiding him toward a choice that would define whatever remained of his life. In the distance, church bells were ringing noon mass, calling the faithful to remember promises made and broken, debts owed and unpaid. "So what do we do?" Miguel asked, knowing that his commander's answer would determine whether he walked out of this office as an ally or an enemy. Morales stared out at the city that had made them both wealthy through violence and compromise, his reflection ghostly in the bulletproof glass. "We pray, Santos, and we hope that prayer is enough." Miguel stared at his commander's reflection in the bulletproof glass, watching a man who'd built an empire on calculated brutality reduced to prayer and hope. The irony felt like acid in his throat, both of them seeking salvation from forces they'd spent their careers denying, begging mercy from the same cosmos they'd violated with every order given, every innocent life sacrificed on the altar of profit. "Prayer," Miguel repeated, tasting the word like poison. "When was the last time you prayed, Esteban?" Morales' laugh came out as a broken sob. "Every night for 5 years. Every goddamn night since I walked out of that church in Medellin." He turned away from the window, and Miguel saw his commander's face properly, not just aged but hollowed out, carved empty by the weight of knowledge that numbers couldn't quantify. Do you know what the worst part is, Santos? It's knowing that she's right, that everything we've built, every dollar we've earned, every life we've destroyed, it all adds up to something, and the bill is coming due. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward like a confession booth. Miguel's rosary seemed to pulse against his chest, each beat a heartbeat counting down to a moment when pretense would become impossible. He thought of Griselda's words, "Help me teach this city to remember," and realized with crystalline clarity that she'd already begun teaching. The lesson had started the moment she'd allowed him to survive what had destroyed 11 other men. What if there was another way? Miguel heard himself saying, the words emerging before conscious thought could stop them. What if someone could offer redemption to people like us? A chance to balance the scales instead of just waiting for judgment? Morales' eyes sharpened, the businessman reasserting itself over the penitent. What are you talking about? Miguel felt the conversation tilting toward an edge he couldn't retreat from. Every word now would be weighed, analyzed, remembered. One wrong phrase and he'd be signing his own death warrant. I'm talking about what you just said, that she's something more than a cartel queen. What if that's exactly why she's here? What if she's offering us a choice instead of just punishment? A choice? Morales moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry to whatever surveillance devices their competitors might have planted. What kind of choice? Miguel's phone buzzed against the conference table where he'd set it, the vibration sharp as gunfire in the tense air. Both men stared at the device as if it were a snake preparing to strike. The screen lit up with an unknown number, but Miguel recognized the pattern of digits. A Miami exchange, local, immediate. "Answer it," Morales said, his voice tight with the kind of fear that came from knowing too much about forces beyond his control. Miguel's hand trembled as he swiped to accept the call. Before he could speak, Griselda's voice filled the silence, calm and implacable as judgment itself. "Miguel, I trust your conversation with Commander Morales has been illuminating." The blood drained from Morales' face as he realized their entire discussion had been anticipated, perhaps even orchestrated. Miguel felt the floor disappearing beneath his feet, the careful balance he'd been maintaining suddenly revealed as an illusion. She'd known. She'd always known exactly what choice he would make, what words he would speak, what moment would arrive when pretense became impossible. "You're listening," Miguel said, his voice barely audible. "I'm offering," Griselda corrected, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "But the window for acceptance is closing faster than you realize. The Zambrano syndicate has learned about last night. They're mobilizing resources for their own attempt, convinced that what happened to your men was some form of sophisticated psychological warfare that can be countered with sufficient brutality." Miguel's eyes met Morales's across the office, both men recognizing the implications. If Zambrano moved against Griselda, the resulting carnage would draw federal attention, disrupt operations across the entire southeastern corridor, potentially bring down every organization operating in Miami. The careful equilibrium they'd all maintained would collapse into chaos. "How long do we have?" Morales asked, speaking directly to the phone with the resignation of a man accepting his fate. "Until sunset," Griselda replied. "After that, the choices become more limited." The line went dead, leaving both men staring at the silent device as if it held the keys to salvation or damnation. Outside, Miami continued its daily rhythm, traffic flowing, people working, the city breathing in ignorant bliss of the forces reshaping its spiritual geography. Miguel felt everything he'd built, everything he'd become, everything he'd sacrificed his mother's hopes to achieve, crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. The careful plans, the measured risks, the illusion that he could navigate between redemption and survival, all of it dissolving into the terrible clarity of a choice that allowed no middle ground. Morales walked to his safe, fingers trembling as he entered the combination. Inside, alongside stacks of untraceable currency and backup identities, lay a rosary identical to Miguel's, worn smooth by desperate fingers, blessed by the same desperate prayers. "All seems lost," Morales whispered, clutching the beads like a lifeline. Everything we've built, everything we are. Through the bulletproof glass, dark clouds were gathering over Miami, promising the kind of storm that washed the world clean.